The racist bank manager humiliated Big Shaq's wife in front of everyone, thinking it would end there. But with one silent move, she triggered a financial earthquake. Within hours, her $2.6 billion fund vanished from the bank, and Monarch Financial began to collapse. What started as humiliation turned into a masterclass in quiet revenge, and justice made them pay in billions. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun hung high over the city skyline, as Monarch Financial's towering glass facade gleamed under its golden rays. The grand lobby, a temple of polished marble and gold-plated fixtures, exuded an air of calm and prosperity. Clients in designer suits milled about, their laughter echoing against the vaulted ceilings. Receptionists with practiced smiles clicked across the floor in expensive heels, offering coffee and hollow greetings. This was a place where money whispered, where power was measured in discreet nods and perfectly pressed suits. Yet beneath this luxurious sheen, something darker pulsed, hidden behind carefully curated smiles and clipped, polite tones. Veronica O'Neal stepped through the revolving glass doors, her presence commanding in a way that didn't require noise or fanfare. She wore a tailored cream dress that moved like silk against her skin, her dark curls pinned up neatly. A slim, understated purse rested in the crook of her arm. She exuded grace, quiet power, and the kind of wealth that didn't scream but murmured. Yet as she approached the gleaming front desk, her eyes caught the subtle shift in the receptionist's posture. A slight stiffness, a quick glance toward the inner office, where Gerald Prescott, the branch manager, stood watching. Gerald Prescott. The man was impeccably dressed, his navy suit crisply pressed, his tie knotted with precision. He was tall, lean, his salt and pepper hair slicked back in a style that whispered old money and conservative ideals. His pale blue eyes lingered on Veronica with a tight smile that didn't quite reach them. He tilted his head slightly, the corner of his mouth quirking up, as if amused by something only he could see. Veronica's heels echoed lightly against the marble as she approached the reception. The woman behind the counter cleared her throat, glanced nervously toward Gerald, and asked for Veronica's identification with a smile that felt too tight, too forced. Veronica complied without a word, her movements fluid and graceful. But as she handed over her ID, she felt it, the momentary hesitation, the flicker of doubt in the receptionist's eyes, a glance back at Gerald, who now leaned against the wall with crossed arms, observing like a hawk waiting to strike. Veronica's lips pressed together in a thin line. She wasn't new to this dance. The weight of unspoken judgments, of being subtly diminished even in spaces her wealth and status should have shielded her from, was an old familiar weight. But today, she remained composed, her posture perfect, her expression unrateable. The receptionist returned her ID, her voice honeyed but trembling, just slightly, as she informed Veronica that there would be a delay. The system was acting up, she said. It might take a little while to access her accounts. Veronica nodded politely, stepping aside to one of the plush leather chairs that lined the lobby. She crossed her legs, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes following the slow, deliberate movements of Gerald Prescott as he approached. He stopped a few feet from her, his lips curling into a smile that barely masked his disdain. "Mrs. O'Neal," he said, his voice smooth as silk but sharp beneath the surface. "Is there something I can assist you with today? I wasn't aware you were visiting." Veronica met his gaze, her expression calm. "I just needed to confirm some transfers. Nothing complicated." Gerald's smile tightened. Of course. I'll see what I can do. But as you can understand, we do have certain protocols. Given the nature of the accounts involved, we need to be extra cautious. I hope you understand." The words were delivered with polished civility, but the meaning behind them was clear. A delay. A subtle, deliberate assertion of control. Veronica inclined her head slightly, her voice soft. "I'm sure you'll handle it, Mr. Prescott." As Gerald retreated back to his office, Veronica's pulse quickened beneath her composed exterior. She felt the weight of the eyes on her, clients pretending not to stare, staff exchanging glances, and Gerald's smug silhouette disappearing behind frosted glass. The air felt heavier, the lobby quieter, as if everyone were holding their breath. She checked her phone, her fingers gliding over the screen, as she opened her messaging app. The number she selected was one she knew by heart, one that didn't need a name attached. The message was simple, her fingers steady as she typed, "Come." There was no need for further explanation. She slipped the phone back into her purse and sat straighter, her posture a silent defiance. Her heart beat steadily, not with fear but with the simmering weight of long-buried frustration. She would not give them the satisfaction of breaking her composure. The seconds stretched into minutes, the quiet hum of the lobby punctuated only by the occasional murmur of conversation. The receptionist stole glances at her, whispering to another staff member who glanced nervously toward Gerald's office. Veronica could feel the tension coiling tighter, like a spring waiting to snap. She imagined the murmurs that would follow. Why did she come here? Who does she think she is? She imagined Gerald in his office, smugly sipping coffee, confident in his ability to stall, to assert his power over her. She imagined him believing this was just another inconvenience for someone like her. A gentle reminder that no amount of money could change certain perception. But he didn't know her husband. He didn't know Shaq. Outside, the hum of traffic mingled with the faint wail of a distant siren. The sunlight through the glass seemed sharper now, glinting off the marble like shards of broken glass. The air felt thick with anticipation, as if the very walls of Monarch Financial were leaning in to listen. Veronica sat perfectly still, her expression a mask of patience, her thoughts steady and sharp as a blade. This wasn't just about her. It was about every glance, every whispered slight, every dismissive look she had endured in places where she was supposed to belong. It was about the silent war waged in boardrooms, and banks, in country clubs, and committee meetings, where wealth didn't erase the weight of skin color. Gerald Prescott thought he was playing a quiet game of delay and dismissal. But the storm was already on its way. And this time, it wasn't coming with thunder. It was coming in silence, in control, in the steady footsteps of a man who understood power, respect, and justice. A man who had been called Big Shaq on courts, but who knew the true meaning of patience and precision off them. Veronica's pulse calmed, her hands resting lightly in her lap, as she watched the elevator doors at the far end of the lobby. She didn't need to look at her phone again. She knew he would come. The quiet before the storm was over, and the first crack of lightning was about to split the sky. The lobby of Monarch Financial buzzed with the quiet hum of wealth. Polished marble floors reflected the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, and the air carried the faint scent of expensive cologne and freshly brewed coffee. Patrons clad in tailored suits and designer dresses moved with purpose, their conversations a low murmur of business deals and social plans. Veronica O'Neal stood at the reception desk, her posture poised and confident. She wore a navy blue sheath dress that complemented her complexion, and her hair was styled in a sleek chignon. Her presence was commanding yet graceful, a testament to years of navigating high society with dignity. The receptionist, a young woman with meticulously applied makeup and a tight bun, glanced up from her computer screen. Her eyes flicked over Veronica, a momentary hesitation betraying her surprise. "May I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but distant. "I'd like to update some information on my account," Veronica replied, her voice calm and measured. The receptionist nodded and began typing. After a few moments, she frowned slightly. "I'm sorry, Mrs. O'Neal, but I need to verify some details. Could you please provide identification?" Veronica reached into her purse and handed over her driver's license. The receptionist examined it, her brow furrowing. She glanced toward the glass-walled office where Gerald Prescott, the branch manager, stood observing the lobby. He was a tall man in his late 50s, with silver hair and a tailored suit that screamed authority. Gerald stepped out of his office and approached the desk. His smile was thin, his eyes cold. "Is there a problem here?" he inquired, his gaze fixed on Veronica. "Mrs. O'Neal is requesting an account update," the receptionist explained, handing him the ID. Gerald took the license and studied it for a moment. "Mrs. O'Neal," he said, his tone patronizing, "I'm afraid we need to conduct a more thorough verification process for high-value accounts. It's standard procedure." Veronica's eyes narrowed slightly. "I've been a client here for years. My information hasn't changed." "Nevertheless," Gerald replied, handing back her ID, "we must adhere to our protocols. Please have a seat while we complete the necessary checks." Veronica took her license and moved to a nearby chair. She sat with her back straight, her hands resting in her lap. Around her, the lobby continued its rhythm, but she could feel the subtle shift in attention. Patrons glanced her way, their expressions a mix of curiosity and judgment. Gerald returned to his office, but his eyes remained on Veronica. He picked up the phone and made a call, his voice low and indistinct. The receptionist resumed her typing, occasionally casting furtive glances toward Veronica. Minutes passed. Veronica remained composed, but the tension in the room was palpable. A man in a pinstripe suit whispered something to his companion, who chuckled softly. A woman in pearls and a designer handbag looked Veronica up and down, her lips pursed in disapproval. Gerald emerged from his office once more, a folder in hand. He approached Veronica, his expression feigning concern. "Mrs. O'Neal, we've encountered some discrepancies in your account records. I'm afraid we'll need to suspend access until we can resolve the issue." Veronica stood, her eyes locking with his. "Discrepancies? What kind of discrepancies?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss the details," Gerald replied smoothly. "But rest assured, we're doing everything we can to rectify the situation." The murmurs in the lobby grew louder. Veronica could feel the weight of their stares, the unspoken assumptions hanging in the air. She clenched her jaw, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse. "I see," she said quietly. "Thank you for your assistance." Gerald nodded, his smile never reaching his eyes. "Of course, we'll be in touch." Veronica turned and walked toward the exit, her steps measured and deliberate. As she passed the reception desk, the receptionist avoided her gaze, focusing intently on her computer screen. Outside, the sun shone brightly, but the warmth did little to ease the chill that had settled over Veronica. She reached into her purse and retrieved her phone, dialing a familiar number. "Shaquille," she said when the call connected, her voice steady. "We have a problem." She ended the call and took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the bustling street. The world moved on, oblivious to the injustice that had just unfolded within the marble walls of Monarch Financial. Inside the bank, Gerald watched her through the glass doors, a smug expression on his face. He turned to the receptionist and said, "Make a note to flag her account for further review." The receptionist nodded, her fingers poised over the keyboard. "Yes, Mr. Prescott." Gerald returned to his office, confident that he had maintained the integrity of his institution, but he had underestimated the resolve of the woman he had just humiliated. Veronica O'Neal was not one to be dismissed lightly. Veronica stepped away from the marble desk, her heels making a measured click against the gleaming floor. The low hum of conversation in the lobby continued around her, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath her composed exterior. Her hand trembled ever so slightly, as she reached into her purse and drew out her phone. She moved to a quiet corner near the tall windows, where the city's bustle outside seemed to blur behind the glass. Shielding her from the stares she could feel digging into her back. Her pulse, though steady, thrummed with a quiet fury, but she kept her face calm, her posture unbending. She tapped Shaquille's number, her fingers steady despite the heavy weight pressing on her chest. The call connected with a soft chime, and the line hummed in her ear. A second passed, a heartbeat of waiting, and then his voice came through, low and even, as if he were standing right beside her. "Veronica." Her lips parted, but for a moment, no words came. The sound of his voice, calm and grounded, cut through the haze of the lobby's quiet murmurs, and Gerald Prescott's smug smirk lingering in her memory. "Shaquille," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's been a situation." He didn't interrupt, didn't demand details. He listened. His silence was a steady, unwavering presence, a lifeline against the suffocating air inside Monarch Financial. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of thought, of understanding, of an unspoken promise. On the other end, she could almost feel his measured breaths, his mind calculating the moves ahead like a master on a chessboard. "I was updating the accounts," she continued, her voice low and controlled. "But Prescott, he made it a spectacle. He questioned my identity in front of everyone, suggested my access needed to be reviewed. She hesitated, swallowing back the frustration rising in her throat. "He humiliated me." There was no sharp intake of breath, no exclamation of anger, only the quiet, solid presence of her husband, anchoring her amid the storm. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice carrying weight, a softness laced with unspoken strength. Veronica closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself. "I'm fine, just tired. But I'm not leaving, not yet." "I'll be there," he said. No question, no hesitation. The simplicity of the statement carried a gravity that made her pulse steady again. She opened her eyes, staring out at the blur of traffic and people moving on the street, beyond the glass. The city continued its endless rhythm, unaware of the quiet battle unfolding inside this pristine lobby. "Thank you," she murmured, the words carrying more weight than they seemed. There was a pause. She knew him well enough to feel the gears turning in his mind, the calculations weighing not just their personal dignity but the larger game at play. Shaq wasn't a man to lash out or make reckless moves. His strength lay in knowing when to strike, and when to wait, when to let the silence speak louder than words. "Stay where you are," he said finally, his voice low and deliberate. "I'm coming." She felt a subtle shift in the air, her muscles relaxing slightly, though her posture remained composed. The lobby's whispers felt distant now, as if insulated by the quiet presence of Shaq on the line. His voice was more than reassurance. It was a reminder that she wasn't alone, that no matter how polished the floors or gilded the surroundings, the power they held extended far beyond what anyone here could comprehend. "All right," she replied softly, her fingers tightening around the phone. They said no more. The silence between them, thick with unspoken understanding, filled the space. There were no questions about details, no need for her to recount the nuances of Gerald Prescott's smirk or the receptionist's apologetic glances. Shaq knew. He always knew. His silence wasn't passive. It was the weight of years of navigating spaces that whispered judgment, of knowing how to turn that quiet into power. Veronica ended the call, her thumb hovering over the screen for a moment, before she slipped the phone back into her purse. Her shoulders squared as she turned, the light catching the edge of her earrings as she lifted her chin slightly. The weight of the moment, of the humiliation and quiet resolve, was still heavy, but now it was accompanied by the anticipation of something shifting. The stillness before a storm. She moved back toward the waiting area, her steps measured but resolute. She didn't glance back at the reception desk, didn't acknowledge the quick, nervous glances sent her way by staff who whispered behind their hands. She didn't need to. The phone call wasn't a dramatic declaration. It was the quiet click of a lock turning, the subtle shift of pieces on a board only she and Shaq could see. There was no rage in his voice, no raised tone, just a steady promise. A vow spoken not in words, but in the space between them. A promise that Gerald Prescott's smirk would not go unanswered, that the weight of his dismissive glances would be met with something far heavier, far more decisive. Veronica sat down again, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze steady and patient. Around her, Monarch Financial's lobby continued its quiet ballet of whispered conversations, and the soft click of heels against marble. But beneath the surface, the tension coiled tighter. Shaq was coming, and with him, the weight of everything Gerald Prescott had failed to recognize. The quiet phone call was over, but the silence it left behind was louder than any words. The glass doors of Monarch Financial hissed open with a soft sigh, and in stepped Shaquille O'Neal, his tall frame filling the entryway like a living monument. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that whispered wealth, his tie knotted with an effortless precision that spoke of power and control. His polished shoes struck the marble floor with deliberate weight, each step sending faint echoes through the lobby. Heads turned, conversations faltered, and for a moment the hum of whispered speculation fell away, leaving only the measured cadence of his approach. The bank's grandeur, its marble columns, crystal chandeliers, and gleaming brass railings, seemed to fade around him, shrinking in significance against the force of his presence. Shaq didn't glance around or acknowledge the eyes following his every move. His gaze was locked ahead, a steady, unyielding line toward the man who had tried to humiliate his wife. Gerald Prescott stood at the far end of the lobby, his shoulders tensing, his lips tightening into a faint, uncertain smile. He straightened his tie, smoothed his suit jacket, but even from a distance, a slight tremor in his hands betrayed the crack in his composure. He hadn't expected Shaq to arrive. He certainly hadn't expected him to arrive like this. Calm, silent, a storm contained within human form. Shaq didn't rush. His pace was steady, each step calculated, as if he were measuring not just the space of the lobby, but the weight of the injustice he was about to confront. He didn't need words to assert his presence. His silence was louder than any outburst, his control more devastating than any shouted accusation. As he moved, Veronica rose from her seat near the window. Her face was composed, her hands folded lightly at her waist, but her eyes met Shaq's with a subtle nod, a silent exchange of understanding and shared resolve. Her pulse steadied, the weight of the morning's humiliation lifting slightly with his arrival. Shaq's eyes flicked briefly to her before returning to Gerald, who had instinctively stepped back, his confidence wavering under the weight of Shaq's silent approach. The manager's face was pale now, his usual smugness replaced by a brittle, forced professionalism. He opened his mouth, a rehearsed apology forming on his tongue, but the words caught in his throat as Shaq stopped just a few feet away. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension, thick with the weight of the moment. Gerald's hands fidgeted at his sides, his voice faltering as he attempted to salvage dignity. "Mr. O'Neal," he began, his tone falsely courteous. "I wasn't expecting." Shaq lifted a hand, just a slight, deliberate gesture, and Gerald's words fell away, silenced as effectively as if Shaq had shouted. The gesture wasn't rude or abrupt. It was a command, a subtle yet unyielding assertion of control. Shaq's gaze bore into Gerald's, steady and piercing, not with overt anger, but with a quiet, simmering intensity that spoke volumes. The lobby's atmosphere thickened, the silence punctuated only by the soft shuffle of patrons shifting uncomfortably, and the faint click of distant keyboards. The staff behind the reception desk exchanged uneasy glances, their previous murmurs now replaced with hushed anticipation. The clients seated nearby pretended to study their phones or scan documents, but their eyes kept darting back to the unfolding scene. Shaq's presence wasn't just physical. It was a shift in the very fabric of the room, where Gerald had wielded subtle power through microaggressions and corporate policies. Shaq wielded something deeper, more resonant, the power of quiet dignity, of a man who knew his worth and demanded it be recognized without raising his voice. Gerald, visibly flustered, attempted to recover. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We were simply following protocol, high-value accounts, you understand. Of course Mrs. O'Neal's business is important to us. We meant no offense." The lie hung in the air, thick and sour. Shaq tilted his head slightly, the corners of his mouth tightening, not in a smile, but in a subtle acknowledgement of the pathetic nature of Gerald's defense. His eyes, dark and unblinking, held Gerald's gaze without wavering. In that silence, the layers of false courtesy and corporate condescension peeled away, exposing the raw core of the encounter. A man's attempt to exert dominance through humiliation, and another man's refusal to let it stand. Shaq took a slow step closer, his voice finally breaking the silence. Not loud, not harsh, but steady, measured. "I know what you did," he said, his tone low and deliberate. "I know what this is." Gerald's mouth opened as if to protest. But Shaq continued, his voice unwavering. "You didn't just question her identity. You questioned her place here. You thought you could make her feel small. You thought the rules didn't apply the same way for her." The lobby was so still now that the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed louder than before. Gerald's hands twitched at his sides, his face flushing a deeper red. He glanced around, as if seeking an ally, but found only silence and downturned gazes. Shaq's voice softened, but the steel beneath it remained. "You thought wrong." He stepped back, his expression calm, almost detached, as though the decision had already been made long before he arrived. His gaze swept the room, taking in the onlookers, the silent staff, the clients pretending not to watch. His presence was a statement, a silent declaration, that respect was not optional, that dignity was not negotiable. He turned to Veronica, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet intensity. She nodded, a slight but firm motion, and the understanding passed between them, like a current. Together, they turned toward the door, the unspoken message clear. They weren't leaving in defeat. They were leaving with their dignity intact, leaving a message hanging in the air behind them, like a challenge yet to be answered. As they exited the lobby, Gerald remained frozen in place, his composure shattered, his authority exposed as a fragile facade. The lobby, once a stage for his power plays, now felt hollow and insubstantial in the wake of Shaq's silent storm. And as the doors closed behind them, the subtle foreshadowing hung like a shadow over the polished marble, a promise that this confrontation was far from over, that the true reckoning was still to come. The lobby of Monarch Financial had settled into a brittle, uneasy silence. After Shaq's arrival, the towering man stood still, his posture relaxed but his presence commanding, as though the entire room had no choice but to pivot around him. Gerald Prescott had returned to his office with the pretense of checking records, his smile now a thin, shaky line that betrayed his desperation. The staff behind the reception desk murmured quietly, casting nervous glances in Shaq's direction as they busied themselves with screens and files, though it was clear no one's focus was truly on the work in front of them. Veronica sat once again in the waiting area, her hands resting lightly on her lap, her face calm, unreadable. The echoes of earlier humiliation were fading now, replaced by a rising tide of anticipation. She exchanged a glance with Shaq, an unspoken message passing between them like a current. This was not over, not by a long shot. The glass doors slid open with a soft whoosh, and the air shifted. A man in a crisp gray courier uniform entered, carrying a leather-bound folder embossed with a subtle gold crest. His expression was neutral, his movements precise, as if he were trained to ignore the weight of the environment around him. Without hesitation, he made his way toward Veronica, who rose slowly to meet him. Shaq's eyes followed the exchange, his expression impassive but his mind sharp, absorbing every detail. The courier extended the folder with both hands, his tone formal yet efficient. Documents for Mrs. Veronica O'Neal. Direct delivery as requested. Veronica accepted the folder without a word, her grip steady. The courier gave a small nod, turned crisply on his heel, and exited as silently as he had entered. The momentary disruption left a lingering charge in the air, like the faint static before a storm. Veronica opened the folder with deliberate calm, her fingers tracing the embossed seal. The pages inside were thick, high-quality stock, bearing the insignia of a rival financial institution. She skimmed the top sheet, her lips tightening ever so slightly, in a hint of satisfaction. Then she handed the folder to Shaq, her eyes locking with his in silent confirmation. He took it, his large hands dwarfing the elegant document, and flipped through the pages with slow precision. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift occurred around them. The employees at Monarch, though pretending to focus on their tasks, were visibly straining to catch a glimpse of the documents. The few clients who lingered nearby stole glances, curiosity drawing their attention away from their devices and papers. The tension thickened as Shaq paused at a particular page, his expression unreadable. Without speaking, he turned and approached Gerald Prescott's office. The manager had reappeared near the doorway, trying to maintain a semblance of control, though his complexion was a shade paler than before. His eyes darted to the folder in Shaq's hand, recognition flickering across his features, followed quickly by something sharper, realization. Shaq stopped a few feet from him, holding the folder slightly raised, not as a threat, but as a silent declaration. The weight of the pages was metaphorical now, their contents heavier than any words Gerald could muster. "You thought you were denying her access," Shaq said, his voice low and steady, each word deliberate and sharp. "What you really did was push away too." The words landed with the force of a hammer. Gerald's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. His fingers twitched against the side of his thigh, a futile, instinctive gesture of control, slipping through his grasp. The other employees froze, the receptionist's hands poised above the keyboard, her breath caught. The clients nearby sat rigid in their chairs, pretending not to listen but hanging on every word. Shaq's tone remained calm, but there was a quiet weight behind it that filled the room. This wasn't a withdrawal, it was a transfer of the largest private investment this bank held. "You didn't just insult my wife, you insulted your own future." The silence that followed was deafening. Gerald's facade of authority crumbled, the professional veneer peeling away under the weight of Shaq's words. His face flushed red, then pale, his throat working as he tried to find something, anything to say. But the damage was done. The realization hung between them, an invisible but undeniable shift in the room's atmosphere. Veronica stepped forward, her posture as poised as when she had first entered. She didn't speak, didn't need to. The folder, the signature, the transfer, they all spoke louder than words. The implications were clear. Monarch Financial had lost its most substantial private client, and with it, a significant chunk of its reputation and stability. The whispers among the staff turned into silent, stunned disbelief. This wasn't just a financial transaction, it was a statement. Gerald finally managed to speak, his voice cracking slightly. "Mrs. O'Neal, surely we can resolve this. There's no need for drastic action. Perhaps we can revisit the terms." Shaq's laugh was soft, almost inaudible, but it was a sound that cut deeper than any shout. "You had your chance," he said, his tone still quiet, but now edged with finality. "You made it clear exactly how you see people like us. This isn't about revisiting terms. This is about showing you that disrespect has consequences." The weight of the revelation settled heavily over the lobby. The elegant marble floors, the glittering chandeliers, the polished brass, all seemed hollow in the face of the truth, now laid bare. Employees who had once flitted about with casual indifference now stood frozen, their gazes fixed on Shaq and Veronica as if they were witnessing the collapse of a kingdom. Shaq handed the folder back to Veronica, his expression calm, his movements precise, She accepted it, her grip firm and unflinching. Together they turned, their departure a deliberate, measured act of defiance. The silence followed them out, a silence that spoke of more than lost investments. It spoke of justice served quietly, of dignity reclaimed. Behind them, Gerald remained frozen, his authority shattered, his bank's future unraveling like the neat folds of the transfer documents. The marble lobby, once a symbol of untouchable wealth and prestige, now felt like a hollow echo chamber of its former self. The $2.6 billion was gone, not just from the ledgers but from the illusion of power Monarch Financial once wielded. And Shaq, the storm of calm, had walked away without ever raising his voice. Gerald Prescott stood rooted near the glass-paneled office he had once ruled with quiet authority, his polished shoes scuffing slightly against the marble as he instinctively shifted his weight, struggling to regain the composure that had long defined his public image. But composure was slipping away from him now, unraveling with each passing second. The realization of what had just transpired, the $2.6 billion that had silently vanished from Monarch Financial's accounts, orchestrated with precision by the very woman he had attempted to belittle, clawed at his insides like a hand tightening around his throat. He licked his dry lips, his mind scrambling to conjure a way out, a path back to the unshakable control he had always believed himself to possess. His glance darted toward the reception desk, where the staff had grown still, their fingers hovering hesitantly over keyboards, pretending to focus but unable to look away. The clients in the lobby had fallen into hushed, anticipatory silence, eyes flicking between Gerald and the tall, immovable presence of Shaquille O'Neal, standing just feet away. Gerald's voice broke the silence, a sharp, cracking sound that betrayed the desperation lurking just beneath the surface. "Mrs. O'Neal, Veronica, please. This is a misunderstanding," he said, his tone oiled with feigned sincerity, but quivering like a violin string stretched too tight. "There's no need to make any hasty decisions. Surely we can come to an agreement." Veronica remained perfectly still, her expression calm, her gaze fixed on him with a composure that both infuriated and terrified him. Her silence was louder than any accusation she could have spoken, her lack of response a damning testament to the power she now wielded. Gerald's hands fidgeted, his practiced smile faltering. He turned slightly toward Shaq, his voice softening, attempting a blend of contrition and appeasement. "Mr. O'Neal, let's not allow this unfortunate situation to escalate. We value your business greatly. There must be a way to resolve this." But Shaq's response was a subtle shake of the head, his gaze steady and unreadable, his very stillness magnifying Gerald's growing panic. The silence between them thickened, the quiet punctuated only by the faint rustle of paperwork at the reception desk and the distant click of a pen being nervously capped and uncapped. Gerald felt his pulse racing, a bead of sweat tracing down his temple despite the cool temperature of the lobby. Realizing that his usual tactics, charm, persuasion, veiled authority were crumbling before him, Gerald's voice dropped to a hushed whisper, intended only for Veronica and Shaq, though it carried just far enough to be overheard by those nearby. "Please," he murmured, his tone raw with desperation. "You know how these things work. Mistakes happen, protocols can be bent. We can fix this. I'll make it right." Veronica's eyes, dark and steady, locked with his. There was no anger there, no overt hostility, only a quiet, unforgiving resolve. Her message was clear without a single word spoken. This wasn't a mistake. This was justice. Gerald's throat tightened, the weight of her silent judgment pressing down on him, like a stone. He felt the cracks splintering beneath his polished surface, the tremors of panic threatening to shatter what was left of his professional mask. He straightened his jacket, forcing a brittle smile, trying to salvage what dignity he could muster in front of the watching eyes. "Of course, there's no need for any drastic measures," he said, his voice wobbling slightly. "Let's sit down, discuss. We can adjust the arrangements to your satisfaction." But the weight of the silence that met his words was heavier than he could bear. Shaq remained unmoved, his broad frame an unyielding pillar of quiet strength, his expression conveying the message that negotiation was no longer an option. Gerald's words, once tools of subtle manipulation and control, now felt empty and impotent against the quiet defiance of the O'Neals. A ripple of unease spread through the lobby. Even the receptionist who had earlier clung to her polite facade now seemed to shrink into her chair, her fingers nervously tapping the side of the monitor. The few clients who remained shifted uncomfortably, sensing the shift in power dynamics that had transformed the once imposing lobby into a silent theater of reckoning. Gerald's breathing quickened, the walls of the bank seeming to close in around him. He imagined the whispers that would follow, the headlines that would bloom across financial publications, the clients who would pull their assets overnight. His empire, built on polished charm and calculated control, was crumbling beneath his feet, and he was powerless to stop it. He took an unsteady step forward, his voice breaking. "Veronica, please, think of the relationship we've built over the years. Think of what's at stake here." But she didn't flinch, didn't soften. Her eyes remained locked on his, unwavering. Her silence was a mirror reflecting his desperation, amplifying the truth he had refused to acknowledge. He wasn't pleading with a powerless client. He was pleading with a woman who now held the fate of his reputation and financial stability in her hands. The moment stretched, heavy and suffocating. Gerald's shoulders sagged slightly, the realization finally dawning with full, suffocating clarity. There was no salvaging this. No amount of hurried explanations or whispered bargains would undo the damage he had wrought. He was a man grasping at the fraying edges of power, only to find his hands empty. Shaq's voice, low and steady, broke the silence at last. "This isn't just about money, Gerald. It's about respect." Gerald swallowed hard, his mouth dry, his heart hammering in his chest. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He was left standing there, a man diminished, his authority stripped away by the quiet strength of those he had underestimated. Veronica turned to leave, her posture poised and graceful, her silence a final unyielding statement. Shaq followed, his gaze sweeping once over the silent lobby before joining her. Their departure was a quiet storm, leaving in their wake a void that no words from Gerald Prescott could ever hope to fill. And as the glass doors closed softly behind them, Gerald was left standing amidst the opulence of Monarch Financial, a man undone not by raised voices or physical confrontation, but by the unrelenting force of quiet, dignified justice. The air outside Monarch Financial had thickened with anticipation as whispers turned into shouts, and the usual steady rhythm of the city was punctuated by the frantic clicking of cameras and the piercing voices of reporters desperate to capture the unfolding scandal. The once pristine glass facade of the bank, a symbol of exclusivity and corporate dominance, now served as the backdrop for an uncontrolled media frenzy. Reporters pressed against the metal barricades hastily set up along the sidewalk, their faces flushed with excitement, their notepads and microphones thrust forward like weapons in the war for breaking news. "Monarch Financial's racism scandal," read one hastily printed headline, displayed on a journalist's tablet, while another nearby screen blazed with Shaq's $2.6 billion move, shakes Wall Street. The air buzzed with speculation, accusations, and the tantalizing scent of a corporate giant teetering on the brink. The glass doors of the bank glistened under the camera flashes, each pulse of light capturing a moment of downfall, as Gerald Prescott's carefully curated empire crumbled in real time. Inside, Gerald's face was pale, his lips thin as he hovered near the lobby's inner glass partition, glancing toward the exit like a trapped animal. His hands trembled as he tried to appear composed, straightening his tie, smoothing the lapels of his suit, but each movement betrayed the panic clawing at his insides. The faint whispers of his staff had turned into an ominous hum, murmurs of discontent and fear, as they stole glances at him and the looming presence of Shaq and Veronica near the door. Shaq stood tall, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow over the polished floor. His expression was calm, his posture relaxed but immovable, as though he were carved from the very marble of the lobby itself. His hand rested lightly on Veronica's back, a silent gesture of support and unity. Veronica's chin was lifted, her expression serene yet sharp, her every step calculated as she prepared to leave not just the building, but the tangled mess of humiliation and power plays behind them. As they approached the glass doors, the rising noise from outside grew louder, the voices of the press sharpening into a frenzy. Cameras were lifted higher, flashes reflecting against the glossy surface, as if determined to capture the exact moment the O'Neals emerged from the shadows of injustice into the blinding light of vindication. The bank's once impenetrable walls, designed to exude wealth and control, now felt fragile, porous under the weight of public scrutiny. Gerald hesitated, torn between the instinct to flee and the obligation to defend the institution that had once been his sanctuary of influence. He took a tentative step toward Shaq and Veronica, his voice low but strained with desperation. "Please," he called, a weak plea that barely rose above the swell of reporters outside. His words were lost beneath the roar of questions and accusations echoing through the glass. Shaq didn't turn back. His silence was louder than any response he could have given, his presence a statement that needed no elaboration. Veronica's hand briefly tightened around the folder in her grasp, her final act of quiet defiance as she prepared to step into the waiting storm. The tension in the air was a taut string ready to snap, the scent of ink and flashbulb residue mingling with the crispness of the autumn breeze seeping in through the slightly ajar doors. The moment their feet crossed the threshold, the press descended like a pack of wolves. "Mr. O'Neal, is it true Monarch lost $2.6 billion overnight? Mrs. O'Neal, how do you feel about the bank's treatment of you today? Is Monarch Financial covering up other scandals?" Questions flew, overlapping and clashing, a chaotic chorus that bounced off the walls and blurred into a cacophony of speculation and outrage. Shaq and Veronica didn't flinch. Their pace remained measured, each step deliberate as they moved through the throng. Shaq's hand remained a steady point of contact on Veronica's back, guiding her with calm precision through the chaos. The cameras closed in, their lenses reflecting not just the couple's composed faces, but also the bank's logo gleaming behind them, now tarnished in the eyes of the watching world. Behind them, Gerald stumbled toward the door, his attempt to maintain dignity faltering with each step. Reporters turned at him, microphones thrust into his face, their questions sharp and insistent. "Mr. Prescott, do you deny the allegations of racial discrimination? Was this transfer a planned move or a reaction to today's events? How will Monarch respond to these revelations?" His responses, thin and desperate, were drowned out by the rising tide of voices, the shouts of accusations and the relentless snapping of camera shutters. As Shaq and Veronica reached the waiting black SUV, a subtle shift in the crowd signaled the magnitude of the moment. The vehicle's door opened with smooth precision, and Veronica stepped inside with the same grace she had shown throughout the ordeal. Shaq lingered for a moment longer, his gaze sweeping the assembled crowd, capturing in that silent glance the weight of the truth now exposed. Without a word, he joined his wife, the door closing behind him with a definitive final sound that seemed to echo across the street. The reporters continued to shout, their voices now tinged with a mix of triumph and frustration, knowing they had witnessed the fall of an institution, but unable to force a soundbite from the silent storm that was Shaq. Inside the bank, Gerald slumped against the glass door, his face pale, his hands trembling, as the full weight of the day's events bore down on him. The walls that had once stood as barriers to accountability were now nothing more than fragile glass panes reflecting his defeat. And as the SUV pulled away, the cameras followed, capturing not just the departure of the O'Neals but the crumbling facade of Monarch Financial behind them. The story was no longer contained within the walls of the lobby. It had spilled into the streets, into the airwaves, into the collective consciousness of a public hungry for justice and scandal. Rumors of deeper corruption, of hidden agendas and unchecked power, swirled like smoke above the ruins of Gerald's carefully constructed empire. The bank's prestige was collapsing in real time, its foundations cracking under the weight of truth and consequence. The media swarm had done its job, and the world was watching, waiting for the next revelation to surface from the shadows of power. In the aftermath of the storm outside Monarch Financial, where camera flashes had burned the scandal into public consciousness, Shaquille O'Neal's demeanor remained as composed as ever. The headlines painted him as a husband defending his wife's dignity, as a titan of business delivering retribution. But beneath the surface of that narrative lay a deeper, more intricate truth. While the media fixated on the public confrontation and the $2.6 billion withdrawal, Shaq had already set in motion something far more deliberate, a move that would resonate through financial circles, far beyond the lobby's marble floors. The next morning, while Monarch's executives scrambled to contain the fallout, Shaq arrived at the towering headquarters of Avalon Trust, a rival institution. Unlike the ostentatious grandeur of Monarch's glass and gold facade, Avalon's design was understated, steel and stone, elegant but unassuming. The lobby was quiet, the atmosphere calm, as Shaq's presence filled the space with an aura of quiet command. There were no reporters here, no camera flashes or whispered accusations. This meeting wasn't for public consumption. This was business, calculated, precise and devastating in its implication. Inside a discreet conference room, a group of Avalon executives awaited him. Papers were spread out on the polished table, documents stamped with the authority of federal investigators, records meticulously compiled over months of quiet scrutiny. Shaq's $2.6 billion transfer hadn't merely been a reaction to Gerald Prescott's public slight. It had been the culmination of a silent investigation, an operation that traced back to whispers of Monarch's involvement in a complex money laundering scheme that had siphoned illicit funds through high-value client accounts. As he took his seat at the table, Shaq's gaze was steady, his hands folded loosely in front of him. The room hummed with the low murmur of anticipation. One of the Avalon executives, a sharp-eyed woman named Celeste Granger, cleared her throat and leaned forward. "Miss O'Neal, the transfer went through seamlessly. The funds are secure, and the federal team is already preparing formal charges against Monarch's senior leadership. Your documentation was more comprehensive than we expected." Shaq offered a faint nod, his voice low but resonant. Monarch underestimated how deep this would go. They thought they could keep playing their games, hiding their tracks under layers of bureaucracy and arrogance. They didn't count on someone watching from the inside. The inside. Over the past year, Shaq had quietly embedded his own forensic team into Monarch's operations, masquerading as a routine audit consulting firm. Their job had been to trace irregularities in high-net-worth account transfers, flagging inconsistencies that pointed to money laundering. The patterns were subtle: small discrepancies, shuffled balances, unusual account movement timings, but with enough data, the web unraveled. Veronica's transfer request had been a masterstroke, a seemingly routine transaction, but one that masked a deeper shift of assets designed to expose Monarch's illicit dealings. Celeste flipped through a dossier thick with evidence. "This will bring down not just Prescott, but several key players. Regulatory bodies have already been alerted. The media's focus on the public scandal has given us the perfect cover to finalize the operation." Shaq's expression didn't shift, but a spark of grim satisfaction flickered in his eyes. "Gerald thought the worst thing I could do was pull our investment. He thought this was about ego, about public image. But that was just the first move. This isn't about a personal slight. This is about accountability." He stood, the quiet authority of his presence filling the room. His gaze swept over the documents, the neatly aligned stacks of evidence, the names of executives and shell corporations exposed for their roles in laundering millions. Every detail had been meticulously planned, every piece of the puzzle laid with precision. Monarch's humiliation in the lobby was the visible tip of an iceberg designed to sink the entire corrupt structure. Outside the conference room, the city moved on, oblivious to the quiet storm gathering strength within these walls. Shaq's decision to keep the investigation under wraps until the right moment was a masterstroke of strategic patience. Public outrage was a smokescreen, drawing attention to the scandal, while the real dismantling occurred behind closed doors. The federal agents, already poised to move in, had timed their investigation with surgical precision, waiting for the moment when Monarch's leadership was most vulnerable. Shaq's calm exterior masked the complexity of the chessboard he had navigated. Every piece moved with purpose. Veronica's transfer request, the silent gathering of evidence, the public exposure of Gerald Prescott's arrogance. Each action layered atop the next, a tapestry of intent designed not just to punish an individual but to dismantle a culture of entitlement and corruption that had festered unchecked for years. As the meeting concluded, Shaq exchanged a brief handshake with Celeste. "When the indictments are unsealed, make sure the community knows what really happened," he said quietly. "This isn't just about one bank or one man. It's about making sure this never happens again." Celeste nodded, her expression resolute. "Understood, Mr. O'Neal. The truth will come out." Shaq left the building as quietly as he had arrived, slipping into a waiting car that pulled smoothly into traffic. The streets outside bustled with life, oblivious to the tectonic shift occurring in their midst. Back at Monarch, Gerald Prescott's world was already unraveling, but he hadn't yet grasped the full scope of the disaster descending upon him. In the silence of the car, Shaq allowed himself a moment of reflection. His mind replayed the quiet humiliation in Monarch's lobby, the smug condescension, the whispers of entitlement. But that memory was now overshadowed by the deeper satisfaction of a plan executed with precision. He hadn't needed to shout or threaten. He had needed only patience, strategy, and a relentless commitment to justice. The world would see the headlines, the scandal, the dramatic loss of funds, but what they wouldn't immediately see, what only those close to the storm would understand, was the depth of the takedown, the dismantling of a corrupt system masked behind suits and marble walls. Shaq's calm was the eye of a storm no one had seen coming, a storm that had already begun to consume those who believed they were untouchable. As the car sped toward the horizon, the city skyline glinting under the afternoon sun, Shaq allowed himself a single fleeting thought. Justice at last was not only served, but meticulously executed. Gerald Prescott sat alone at the long, gleaming table of the Federal Investigation Chamber, the stark white walls closing in around him like a noose tightening with every passing second. The overhead lights cast harsh, unforgiving shadows, their glare reflecting off the polished surface of the table and the stack of files laid out before him, each one a damning testament to his misdeeds. He stared at the documents, but his mind couldn't focus on the black and white evidence that outlined his fall from power. His hands trembled slightly as he traced the edge of a folder, trying to summon the composure that had once been second nature. But the composure was gone now, stripped away along with the carefully curated facade he had worn for years. The investigators across from him, their expressions cool and professional, flipped through pages, their eyes unreadable. The silence was heavy, broken only by the faint scratch of pens and the occasional click of a tape recorder. Gerald opened his mouth, his voice catching in his throat, but no words came. He was acutely aware of the weight of his isolation, the realization that the empire he had built was nothing more than a brittle shell now cracking under the weight of accountability. Gerald's mind raced back to that moment in Monarch Financial's lobby, the look in Veronica O'Neal's eyes, steady and unflinching, her silent message of justice delivered with a calm that had unsettled him more than any raised voice could have. And Shaq standing there like a silent storm, unmovable and implacable, his quiet presence a statement of strength that now echoed louder than ever. Gerald had thought he could contain the fallout, spin the narrative, salvage his reputation. But now, seated under the clinical gaze of federal investigators, he felt the walls collapsing inward, his illusions of control crumbling to dust. One of the investigators, a woman with sharp features and an unyielding stare, leaned forward, her voice precise. "Mr. Prescott, the evidence clearly shows a pattern of unauthorized transfers and concealed accounts linked to money laundering operations. These transactions were executed under your authorization. Do you have an explanation?" Gerald's throat was dry. He swallowed hard, his lips parting as if to speak, but the words refused to come. The walls seemed to tilt, the pressure in the room intensifying. He thought of the late-night meetings, the quiet agreements sealed with a nod, the invisible ink of illicit contracts. He had believed himself untouchable, a master of the game. Now the pieces had turned against him. I was following standard protocols," he stammered, his voice thin, barely audible. "There were misunderstandings, miscommunications." The investigator's gaze hardened. "Mr. Prescott, these documents bear your signature. The transactions were approved by you personally. Multiple witnesses have corroborated the pattern of behavior that facilitated these schemes." A bead of sweat traced down Gerald's temple. He looked down, his shoulders sagging, his breath coming in shallow bursts. His mind conjured images of the boardroom where he once held court, the silent nods of agreement from colleagues, the glances of deference. But those colleagues were gone now, their statements filed neatly in evidence folders, their testimonies delivered with clinical detachment. He was alone, a man stripped of allies, his world reduced to a table, a stack of files and the unyielding stares of investigators. In another part of the city, in a quiet office with floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the skyline, Shaq and Veronica sat side by side, watching the unfolding drama from a discreet distance. Their expressions were calm, composed, not triumphant, but resolute. Veronica's hand rested lightly on Shaq's, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had navigated together. They weren't watching for the spectacle of Gerald's collapse. They were watching for the final chord in a symphony of justice that had begun with a humiliating confrontation and now culminated in accountability. Shaq's eyes, steady and thoughtful, reflected the weight of what had transpired. He had known from the start that Gerald's downfall wouldn't be delivered by loud accusations or public theatrics. It would come from within, from the slow unraveling of arrogance and entitlement, from the weight of truths, long concealed finally dragged into the light. His message to Gerald was unspoken, but crystal clear. Your fall was inevitable. Back in the interrogation room, Gerald's composure continued to erode. He shifted in his seat, his hands wringing together, as if trying to squeeze out an answer that would redeem him. But the investigators were unmoved, their questions relentless, their evidence airtight. Each revelation chipped away at the foundation of the life he had built. Each answer he gave a feeble attempt to patch cracks too wide to conceal. The realization settled over him like a heavy shroud. There would be no salvaging his name, no spinning of narratives to recast himself as a misunderstood leader. His reputation, once the bedrock of his influence, was now quicksand, pulling him down with every passing moment. The people he had relied on, the structures of power he had manipulated, had all turned away, leaving him to face the consequences alone. Outside, as the sun dipped low behind the city's skyline, Shaq and Veronica rose from their seats, their silhouettes framed against the glass. Their departure was quiet, purposeful, leaving behind the spectacle of Gerald's reckoning for the world to dissect. They didn't need to witness the final collapse. The truth had already spoken, loud and irrevocable. Gerald Prescott, once a man of polished power and calculated dominance, now sat slumped in a chair, his voice a whisper lost in the cold confines of an interrogation room. The silence that followed his last, faltering statement was heavier than any verdict, more damning than any headline. And somewhere beyond the walls, where justice had finally found its mark, Shaq's message lingered like a quiet echo. This is the price of arrogance. Your fall was always coming. The early morning sun cast a warm, golden light over the modest but elegant facade of Unity Bank, the new community institution Shaq and Veronica O'Neal had helped bring to life. Its simple design stood in sharp contrast to the cold grandeur of Monarch Financial. Here, the glass wasn't meant to intimidate but to welcome, its clean lines reflecting the clear sky above. The sidewalk in front of the bank buzzed softly with life. Children laughed as they played tag near the entrance, their carefree voices rising into the air like birdsong, while families and small business owners mingled, chatting with bank staff and each other as if gathering at a neighborhood gathering rather than a financial institution. Shaq stood just outside the entrance, his towering figure casting a long but gentle shadow across the sunlit pavement. He wore a simple dark blazer over an open-collared shirt, the crisp lines of his clothing at ease with the warm morning breeze. Beside him, Veronica's hand rested lightly on his arm, her posture graceful, her smile soft but unshakable. Together they stood not as figures of wealth and power but as pillars of something deeper: hope, resilience, and a commitment to something lasting and meaningful. The crowd outside moved with a quiet anticipatory energy. No flashing cameras, no shouted questions, just a soft hum of conversations, of greetings exchanged between neighbors, of families shaking hands with staff whose names they already knew. This wasn't the sterile, scripted ritual of high finance. It was something more human, more real. The air carried the scent of freshly baked bread from the bakery across the street, of coffee brewing from the corner cafe, of flowers newly planted in the public garden that framed the bank's entrance. Veronica looked up at the building, her eyes catching the gold-lettered sign that read, Unity Bank, and the slogan below it, built on trust, open to all. She remembered the weight she'd carried walking into Monarch Financial that fateful day, the suffocating press of judgment and arrogance. Here, the atmosphere was different, open, light, unburdened, a place where dignity wasn't granted as a reluctant favor, but recognized as a given right. Beside her, Shaq watched the children darting between benches and the older couple walking arm in arm past the new bank. His expression was thoughtful, reflective. He'd played many roles in his life: athlete, entrepreneur, advocate. But this was different. This was about legacy, not in the sense of fortune or fame, but of impact, of creating a space where people who had been excluded and dismissed found a place where they belonged. Inside the bank's glass doors, staff moved with quiet efficiency, their smiles genuine, their greetings personal. Each teller knew the names of the people in line. Each financial advisor took the time to explain, to listen. It was a stark contrast to the sterile indifference of the world they had left behind. The past, the humiliation, the arrogance of Gerald Prescott, the stifling corridors of Monarch, seemed to fade, its sharp edges softened by the clear light of this new day. Shaq felt a subtle shift within himself, the weight he hadn't fully acknowledged until now easing from his shoulders. He glanced at Veronica, her face serene, her eyes reflecting a quiet satisfaction. They hadn't come here for revenge. They hadn't built this place to gloat over the downfall of those who had underestimated them. They'd done it to prove a simple truth, that respect and dignity were not privileges granted by wealth or status, but inherent rights everyone deserved. As they stood, a little girl in a yellow sundress ran up to them, her hands clutching a small homemade thank you card. She handed it to Veronica shyly, her wide eyes shining. Veronica knelt, accepting the card with a warmth that melted the remaining chill of the past. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of sincerity. The girl beamed before skipping back to her mother, who nodded her thanks from a distance. Shaq looked out at the city beyond, at the buildings catching the light, at the faces of people who might once have felt invisible in places like Monarch, but now stood tall, welcomed and acknowledged. The sky was clear, the air filled with possibility. His mind, sharp and calculating when needed, now felt quiet, settled. The battles fought in silence, the strategies layered beneath the surface. All had led to this moment, a new dawn, not just for them, but for everyone willing to stand against injustice and fight for something better. Veronica stood and turned to Shaq, her hands slipping into his, their fingers intertwining. "It's a good start," she said quietly, her voice steady. Shaq's lips curved into a faint smile, the simple powerful affirmation in her words settling into his bones. As the morning sun continued to rise, casting long, soft shadows across the sidewalk, Unity Bank's doors remained open, a symbol not just of a business but of a community reborn. The weight of past injustices felt lighter now, carried not by one person but shared among many, each step forward a collective act of resilience. Shaq and Veronica remained there for a while longer, watching the gentle hum of life unfold around them, the quiet strength of those who knew that real power came not from domination or spectacle, but from standing firm, speaking softly, and never ever backing down. And as the day stretched forward, the final thought lingered, a simple truth shimmering in the clear morning light. Justice, when pursued with integrity, does more than punish. It heals, it rebuilds, and it paves the way for those who follow. If this story stirred something in you, don't just move on. Dive deeper. Stand for what's right. Challenge the silence, and spark change where it's needed most. The next chapter is yours to write. Will you rise to meet it? The story isn't over, and neither is the fight.